Okay, so in this video we're going to be looking more at some of the weaknesses associated with budgetary policy. So what we're looking at here is when you're analysing the impact of the budget and the effectiveness of the budget, you need to comment on what are some of these weaknesses. So the first thing is that there are some adverse political constraints that can limit budget options. So what I mean by that is that policies are subject to a lot of political hurdles. So any policy that's implemented needs to go through the Senate, as well as the House of Representatives. There's often a lot of policies that the government will implement that take a long time to get through both the House of Representatives and the Senate. They can be blocked for a range of reasons. They may not have a lack of majority. They may have a lack of majority in the Senate, so not enough people vote for it in the Senate or the upper house. So there may be certain contractionary policies that get rejected because the Senate doesn't pass them. And that can lead to more debt in the long term because they were trying to be contractionary but they weren't able to be. They may block policies because they think they're going to have an adverse voter reaction. And often policies need both federal and state approval. So the problem with that is there are a lot of constraints which limit our ability to effectively implement policies, and can also mean that it takes a long time for certain policies to get through the different houses. The second thing is that policies can be subject to political bias. So when budgets occur just before elections, there's the chance that bad policy decisions can be made with the intention of generating votes, or so that they can stay in power. So for example, the minerals resource rent tax was abolished because there was a lot of lobbying by the mining companies, and there was a lot of advertisements, and even though that policy may have been better for the economy, the government succumbed to the interest of these lobby groups. So sometimes they are subject to political bias because they're trying to buy votes. Sometimes they can succumb to the interests of certain people that have a lot of power, even though that policy may have been in the best interest of the government at that point in time. There's long implementation lag. So I talked about in the first slide that it takes a long time to get a lot of these policies through the different houses of parliament. The state parliament and the federal parliament need to pass these policies. So that can include infrastructure, health, education. So what can end up happening is it can take so long for policies to be implemented that they take too long. We're past the trough by the time they actually get implemented. So, if it took a policy 2 years to get through the Senate that was trying to be quite expansionary, we have reached a different phase in the business cycle by then. So we may be in, a peak or an expansion phase, and then the pro-cyclical policy just ends up increasing the size of the peak. So infrastructure projects, for example, can take years to have their impact on aggregate demand. So we may no longer be in a recession when they actually fully get implemented. So that can lead to them having high inflationary pressures because when they're actually implemented, we're in a peak phase. So the length of time that it takes to get through the houses is another problem, which can lead to policies having a pro-cyclical effect. There's a lack of flexibility to alter some parts of the budget. There are policies announced throughout the year, so there are mini budgets throughout the year, but it can be particularly difficult to raise taxes or cut outlays at certain points in time. So in a boom, it can be highly politically unpopular to reduce pensions or reduce wages of public services. So it can make the budget quite inflexible to do certain things because they know that it's hard to implement certain policies throughout the year, and it also can be quite unpopular to implement policies throughout the year. Budgetary policy can also be less effective during a boom because the government generally contractionary policies take a long time to get through the Senate. So as the government is less able to immediately restrict disposable incomes, and it makes it really hard for them to try and reduce aggregate demand quickly in a boom because it can be quite unpopular and takes a long time to get through contractionary policies. Monetary policy is different because the RBA is not subject to the public. So if we're in a boom, they'll just go, yep, we'll raise interest rates, and it has a more immediate effect. Financial constraints. So the government, if they're facing financial constraints, this is something that's really important at the moment. So if there's limited money available for the economy, like there is at the moment, during the slowdown, the government may want to implement tax cuts, they may want to be expansionary, but because they have this idea of, or because they have a lack of money, and because they're committed to that medium-term fiscal strategy of trying to reduce deficits to get back to surplus, it can be hard for them to actually increase the structural deficit during troughs now because of that idea of being committed to retraining. Committed to getting rid of our deficits in the long term. In the reverse, if confidence is strong, contractionary budgets can be made less effective than expected in slowing the level of aggregate demand as well, for certain reasons. But yeah, sometimes they don't have enough money basically to stimulate growth, and it's not in line with their other goals. It can undermine monetary policy, so running budget deficits to stabilise economic activity can sometimes lead to higher interest rates. So we talked about this in the last video. They can when the economy is weak and the government decides to run a big budget deficit and they sell bonds, this puts upward pressure on local interest rates. So that can mean that monetary and budgetary policy are working, they're undermining each other because the higher budget deficits are leading to higher interest rates, where monetary policy is trying to be expansionary. In a surplus, we might be experiencing the monetary policy would be trying to slow the economy down, but because the government doesn't need as much of the the bank's money, that may lead to lower interest rates, which may cause more inflationary pressures. So that idea of crowding out and crowding in can undermine monetary policy, because during a trough, monetary policy wants to be expansionary, but the government's demanding much of the bank's funds that it's causing interest rates to go up. There can also be conflicts between various goals. So, for example, we might implement a mildly contractionary budget to slow inflation, because inflation's an issue, but that may have problems for economic growth or unemployment. Expansionary policies that are designed to boost growth may have problems for inflation. So policies to return the budget to surplus, like slowing welfare or government spending, may reduce equity. So, for example, a good example of this conflict may be the government's promoted, their goal is to achieve fiscal consolidation. They want to be contractionary to try and return some of the government finances, but that's on the flip side, that's going to have conflicts with trying to provide government services, to provide adequate health, public transport, education. So there's a trade-off between getting back to surplus and achieving equity in the distribution of income. Another example, contractionary budgets might involve higher taxes and less spending on education, research and development, and that can have negative impacts on our productive capacity and aggregate supply. So that idea of trying to achieve fiscal consolidation can be in conflict with long-term sustainable growth if it affects our productive capacity and ability to supply in the long term. Psychological constraints, often it depends on the level of confidence in the market. So even when we're in a trough, if the government is to implement tax cuts, it may not have a big impact on consumer and business spending because they might not be very confident, so they just save most of the money. If confidence is strong during like a peak in the business cycle, contractionary budgets may not slow aggregate demand because people are happy to go into debt anyway. So even if they're charged higher taxes, they'll just go into more debt. Thank you.